Okay, welcome to panel number 21, focused on software estimating and how we manage performance of software programs and execution through an earned value management system. I'm really delighted today to be your panel chair. We've got a couple of great papers today, and they're really different in terms of where they address the overall software development and program management process. Our first paper today is going to be from First Lieutenant Nick Biancalana. I hope I got that right, Nick. His paper is on improving software cost estimating methods in defense systems. Nick is currently at the Air Force Institute of Technology. And our second paper today is from Mr. Gordon Kranz, who is participating in an AIRC study regarding third-party business systems compliant assessment and an approach to the compliance part of how we apply earned value on our defense programs and on our contracts. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Lieutenant General Dave Bassett. I'm the Director of the Defense Contract Management Agency. In my current role, DCMA is kind of the compliance and verification part of earned value in the Department of Defense. In every job I've had up until now, I was a program manager, and I was focused on the application of program management techniques to managing cost and schedule. I spent nearly 20 years in a PM shop, and in fact, my very first program that I was ever an assistant program manager on was as the chief software engineer for the network on the Army's Future Combat Systems program. And so that effort had a great deal to do with trying to estimate just how much software the network would constitute, both in its mission command systems, its network management systems, its middleware development. And so in one of my very first meetings with the contractor in Southern California, I found myself at a large table seated somewhere down from Mr. Barry Beam, who was out of the Software Engineering Institute there at Carnegie Mellon. And Barry was the father of Agile development and also the creator of one of the very first software estimating models called Kokomo that was designed to kind of get at trying from a parametric standpoint, determine the amount of effort necessary to deliver a certain amount of software code. That experience, I think, was transformative for me in the sense that I began to really understand the complexity of what modern software development presents to a program manager. There's virtually no software development that we do today in the Department of Defense that relies solely on development of new code. It's always, and I mean this, it's always these days bringing together existing code, modifying existing code, combining commercial code and new code, and delivering that to a customer, usually in an agile development process. That process, combining those things together, presenting it as a single estimate for the total hours and dollars that are necessary to produce that software, is difficult, even in the best of circumstances. There's lots of different factors that affect the estimate of how long code would take to deliver and how many hours and people it will take to deliver it, particularly in an agile development, where you're giving a lot of flexibility as to the exact amount of content that's in each individual build. And so I think today's panel provides a useful set of bookends, both from an academic perspective, looking at how you can better estimate software in that complex environment that I described. And I think Nick's done a great job at capturing that. And then on the back end, when we go to manage that program, what's the appropriate set of tools to manage both cost and schedule throughout the execution of that program? And then can we certify those systems in a different way, since today we kind of have a one-size-fits-all earned value management standard that we expect contractors to comply with and implement, particularly on any contract over $100 million, $100 million of RDT&E effort. And so we've got the standard at 100 million. A lot of development happens to below that level, but regardless of the size of the program, you want to have the right management tool that gives you the insight into not just what did you think it would cost, but what did it actually cost, and where are you at, so you can take actions in terms of managing that program better. I frequently remind the employees of the Defense Contract Management Agency that we are not the Defense Contract Monitoring Agency. And we need program managers to be managers and not monitors. It's about taking action. And effective earned value, or I'll say effective contract performance measurement tools, whether it's earned value or something maybe a little different that's tailored to the needs of software development, is going to be important going forward into the future for the department. Today, we have the adaptive acquisition framework to give program managers a range of pathways to help deliver capability across our joint force. I have talked to DCMA about building what amounts to an adaptive contract administration framework so that we have multiple tools in our toolbox as we administer contracts. And I think the time has come for there to be more than one earned value management tool in the toolbox, so that we can have an adaptive set of tools tailored to the kind of work that we're doing in each of those domains. And so I think this comes at a really great time for the department as we struggle with some of these very challenging issues that have a massive impact on the capability that we deliver to our warfighters. So with that, I'd like to kick it over to Nick Biancalana. I'm sorry, I may say it right by the time we're done, Nick, but I'd like to turn it over to you to present your paper.
All right. Thank you, sir, for the introduction. As General Bassett said, I am First Lieutenant Nick Biancalana, recent graduate, very recent graduate of the Air Force Institute of Technology, got a master's degree in cost analysis, and this is the culminating thesis research that came out of the program. And so alongside my awesome committee, my fantastic advisor, Dr. Dan Ritchell, along with Drs. David Fass, Tony White, and Lieutenant Colonel Scott Driley, could not have done any of this without a lot of their help. So this is a culmination of a lot of hard work and a lot of great instructors along the way too. So the main topic of my thesis really involves trying to use historical cost and historical ESLOC data to create distributions that can model and simulate future values. And so using this data, the hope was to formulate these specific distributions that are now combinations of characteristics of different programs that estimators could use to find a more specific environment that they can use their software in to get a best result for the project they're trying to assess. And so a main assumption of this research is that I wanted to use information that was known at the beginning of a project. There is a multitude of data, as I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are aware, that we can get from these projects, but I wanted to use really only information that somebody could have at the very start and at the genesis of a project to try and get at the very front end of the estimating process and get a firm foot in the ground to try and estimate the costs moving forward and effective size. So with regards to this presentation, the research questions that I looked at were, what are the shapes and parameters of the distributions that map to each data subset? And then how does software size and cost change within characteristics while holding one the same and varying another, to see how different sets of characteristics change between each other. So a couple different methods that I used for this research. There's incremental analysis that I'll get into in the next couple slides, comparing median values of non-recurring cost per ESLOC and ESLOC, and then statistical tests to find differences between subsets. So for the data set, I had a large data set that was provided by AFL-CMC, and Mr. Sean Valentine graciously helped consolidate multiple data sets to now get this fully comprehensive data set that has SRDR data for a bunch of different WBS elements on a multitude of software elements of projects, but then also coupling them with the corresponding 1921 cost information. So now I had an all-in-one source that directly had software components with the actual costs that were incurred in that project. So I could look at both of them at the exact same time and analyze them. So overall, there were 42 projects The pie chart shows the distribution or the proportions of projects. These proportions were very similar when you looked at the actual number of data points. So there weren't any particular commodities that overpowered or created some undue influence on the overall data set. There were two sort of different cuts of the data set depending on which dependent variable I was looking at. For the cost per ESLOC analyses, I had to trim the data a little bit more because I had to trim out data that was missing cost and missing ESLOC, whereas just for ESLOC, I only had to worry about the ones I was missing ESLOC for. So I had slightly more data points for that analysis, but this is just an overall general cut of the sort of projects I was working with. And you can see that there's a big presence for EAS, the software, the solely software projects, but then also a good chunk for aircraft and space projects as well, and rotary wing. But moving forward, this is an example. This is just one of many examples, or I'm sorry, one of many results that came out. These are just these are raw results regarding cost per ESLOC. And so the way to interpret this, these are all in thousands of dollars per ESLOC. And so this incremental analysis is what I was calling it, is you're now looking within one contractor and seeing how their cost per ESLOCs change between the different commodities that they're working on. So the way to interpret this chart is to work in columns, and you pick the contractor that you're wanting to look at, and you can compare. For instance, with contractor one, you can directly see how their aircraft commodity compares to their rotary wing commodity and space and so on. And so those represent the median cost per ESLOC values for those contractors. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some of the statistical tests that I used will show distinct differences. And one of them is what's called a Steele-DeWass test. And that's what these the superscript letters represent. So within one contractor, if two commodities share a letter, that means they're distinctly different. There is something about those commodities that make them uniquely different from one another. Those details can be within the project, within how the contractor does their business, how they may assign a team, different sort of complexity things that may be outside of the scope of just the cost alone. But this was an essential component of the analysis to see which commodity and contractor combinations needed to be looked at more specifically. In many situations, one might just put an overarching aircraft distribution, say there's a log normal distribution with certain parameters, and one could model the entire aircraft commodity. What I was looking for is, do certain contractors do some things differently that makes it necessary to look at how they do that specific commodity different. And that was what I was looking for, to see if there were specific situations that required a more specific distribution that would enhance the estimator's ability to get really drilled down to the specific project they're trying to estimate. Now, at the very bottom, the KW is the p-value of the Kruskal-Wallis score. I won't get too into the weeds of what those, of how those arise and stuff, but essentially, if they're significant, if they're sufficiently low, or in this case, if they're just red, that means there were significant differences in how certain contractors did different commodities. So there's something inherent to a contractor themselves and how they perform their business that inherently changes how commodities cost, or how much they cost. So there's something within the commodity that's important. And so this analysis was also performed just for ESLOC, and there were, again, similar results that are all published in the research as well. So overall, once all of the different results were processed, I came to a distribution for every division of the data set. So there was a distribution for every commodity, every system type, every contractor, every contract type, and every service. And in some cases, a more specific one was warranted. So now you get into pairs of characteristics. So you would have a contractor commodity pair, or you would have a service contract type pair that has shown that that is important to drill down to that level of specificity. Moving forward, cost and ESLOC can vary within the exact same program characteristic. So within one program characteristic, another characteristic could change that value wildly. And so it really just shows the importance of getting the most specific analogy possible in some situations to get a more proper estimate. And in the ESLOC analyses, some of those differences were lost. So it was mostly found in cost. Some general findings were the software projects seem to be cheapest yet also largest for the Army. This could be specific to the projects that were in this data set, or something how the Army does their business, or how they do their software projects. Also, specific contract types can impact size and cost, and so this goes all the way to the level of it goes beyond just cost or fixed price. It goes also to, is it incentive? Is it an award fee? Is it fixed fee? And those sort of levels. And so that's where the impact is. And those impacts are lost if it's just generalized to, is it cost? Is it fixed? So there's differences that are baked into those specific contract types. And lastly, the EAS, missile, and UAV, they all experience different ESLOCs depending on service. So again, there could be something unique to the projects themselves, but at least within the service and how those differences were compared, there's something about the services and how they conduct those different commodities that are different from one another. And so the final bullet was actually kind of what started this whole research. Is the sponsor of this research really wanted to have kind of an arsenal for estimators and the analysis teams to use, so that they had a great tool that they could go to find the distribution that they need for a given situation. And so this tool on this slide is one example of the cost per ESLOC decision tool. And so the way that one would interpret this is, you start all the way on the left, you figure out what the commodity is. That would be something that's going to be fairly well known at the beginning of a project. What type of commodity is the project that I'm estimating? And so you start all the way at the left, and then moving to the next section into service. If any of those other elements are met, you then stop in the SP8 or the SP3, whatever SP number, whatever it is, that goes to the list of all the distributions that I found. And so it gives the specific tool to then use for example, an EAS project done for the Army. There's a specific distribution that models those projects. And if no conditions are met, you just keep moving to the next section, into the next section. And if none of them are met, then you just use the broad general overarching distribution for that commodity. And that's then sort of the best option to use to estimate those commodities. And so again, you just keep moving forward. If any of those conditions are met, you stop. That's your best fit. If not, your general one is your next best option. And so there is a tool for this for just estimating ESLOC as well. It's the same exact concept of trying to find the most specific tool. And so again, at the end of the research, there's just an arsenal of distributions where an estimator could say, okay, I know I'm estimating a space project. Is it done by contractor 2, contractor 4? Oh, it doesn't matter. Okay, then I know I can just use this overarching space commodity distribution to model my cost or model my size, whichever way it works out. So that was kind of the crux of this research, was trying to arm the estimator with a toolkit, but also a decision tool to help them figure out which one would be the best to model the individual project that they're trying to estimate, and have confidence knowing that that's a proper tool to use, and they'll have firm ground to stand on when it comes time to defend their estimate, knowing that this distribution was made for this estimating environment. So, I like to think that this would be a very functional tool for them, and something that can certainly help them in their estimating process, that now they have the distributions to input into their software, and they can simulate different outcomes, and know that it was made for that specific situation. And that concludes the end of my research, the end of my presentation. I know we'll have a Q&A section, so I'd love to answer any questions that anybody has.
So Nick, I think we're going to take questions at the end.
Okay.
We don't have any Q&A in the chat so far. I'm sorry, in the Q&A section, but we'll take Q&A at the end. Thanks for running that down. I hope our participants there, everybody that's listening to the panel, is just queuing up their very best questions for you at the end.
Looking forward to it.
When you start with a good estimate, and I think Nick's tool is all about achieving that good estimate, and then you place that estimate on contract, you've got to then go be able to manage that in terms of execution, and so that you have an understanding of what the contractor has to do and how many hours of effort and dollars it will take for them to perform that function.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, that's where earned value or some other management tool is necessary to inform the program manager.
Right.
Our next presentation is about how looking at an alternative to what we do today, which is DCMA's evaluation and certification of contractors' earned value management systems, but alternatives to how that might be performed in the department. Gordon's paper is really the result of a team that's been working to explore how we might implement some NDAA language, which was brought to bear back in 2017. We continue to have, I think, great dialogue with Gordon and the team here in DCMA, regardless of where we end up. I think at least for my agency, this is about ensuring that what we ask our contractors to do in terms of their contract is implemented effectively to provide the right insight to program managers. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Gordon, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. And Michelle, would you mind, if you wouldn't mind running the slides, that would be great. So you can share your screen, I'd appreciate it. But yeah, so good afternoon, thank you. And as General Bassett said, I'm leading a study. The study is actually being run out of the Advanced Acquisition Innovation Research Center. It's a consortium of universities. Stevens University is kind of the lead of that. So Phil Anton, Thomas Brush are part of the team. And this study was sponsored by OSD as well as Space Force, so Mr. Albert Schwartzman. So what I'm going to be talking about, next slide, is essentially a variety of things. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about incremental acquisitions and EVM, not necessarily because it relates to the study, but because it emphasizes the need to do disciplined program management, particularly on these incremental acquisitions and agile. It's even more important to have some insight into cost, schedule, technical. Then we'll talk about, what an earned value management system is. I did look at the attendees, and a lot of you know what this is, but for those who don't know the details of it, I've got a simplified version I'd like to walk you through. And then we'll get into the compliance process, and then the actual emphasis of the study, which is the fiscal year 11 and fiscal year 17 NDAAs. And we'll talk about the study and its status. So next slide, please. So again, the Department of Defense, as we've talked about, is struggling with trying to keep up with the pace of the emerging threat, budget challenges, that sort of stuff. They're looking for agile practices, particularly in software, to try to get incremental deliveries that get to the user quicker, faster, cheaper. But you still have to manage those programs and balance cost, technical, and schedule. And it requires a disciplined program management practice. Well, earned value management is one of many tools that can support the program manager to do this. And there's only a certain kinds of programs that earned value is mandated on. And those are the ones that would require compliance and that sort of thing. But as General Bassett said earlier, there's a whole host of programs that are being executed, a lot of dollars being spent, that disciplined program management needs to be done on those as well. And whether earned value can be tailored or be looked on as leveraged, that's one thing that could be looked at. So, so agile methods been around, I guess, Mr. Beam, was the founder, I guess, but there was a manifesto in 2001 where a group of folks got together and said, here's what agile is all about. Government's been, contractors have been executing using agile methods. Well, when I was in the government in about 2014, the service representatives, EVM service representatives, came to me and says, hey, I don't understand how agile programs can be managed, and everybody's saying EVM doesn't apply. So we kicked off a EVM collaboration with industry and government, And there's guides out there, an industry guide that if you are mandated to do EVM and you're doing Agile, there are ways to tailor the way you look at it. And there's also a government program management guide to help give program offices some insight as to how they could look at it if EVM is mandated. We're all struggling with Agile methods and cost and schedule, but the key is that earned value is important as a program management tool, and it is so important that the data is accurate and represents what's going on the programs, that there's actually a standard out there that represents what a good earned value management system should represent. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So next slide, well, no, not next slide. This here's, so this is a very simplified version of what an earned value management system is. And it really encompasses all of these things. It can be quite complex, but essentially an EVMS is the integration of processes and procedures, internal business processes and procedures that are used by by a contractor with their financial systems in order to establish a plan that can be tracked, and then through variances they can figure out how they're doing against plan, and then make program management adjustments. But in more detail, Nick's presentation talked about the importance of a cost estimation. Well, that's fundamentally the basis from which the cost baseline comes from, is the cost estimate that there's a work decomposition, there's cost estimation, there's scheduling that work together to try to figure out what the baseline plan is. And whether you're doing earned value or not, those are things that complex programs need to do. Earned value offers a particular way to do that. You come up with a baseline plan, and then you have to align and track progress using your financial system. So you got things like charge numbers, and whether it's material, labor, that sort of stuff, that has to align with the way your financial systems track actuals, because earned value comes up with that estimate due to detailed progress they get from the engineering community and statusing the schedule. There's actual progress, and they compare that to actual cost against planned progress and planned cost, and then they can come up with variances and that sort of stuff. And that data integration is inside an EVM data engine, which can be a variety of different kinds of tools. That engine kicks out monthly reports, but EV is much more than reviewing monthly reports. It's the engagement of the technical team on a daily basis that they have, and understanding where issues are coming, that sort of thing. This here is the sort of the financial and schedule monthlies that say where they're at. There's analysis that has to happen on that. EV can provide as much data as it wants. If it's not used, or if it's not interpreted in ways that a program manager can try to understand it, it's not any good, because after all, it's earned value is a program management tool, and it's essential that the technical team and the financial team work together to figure out what is that data telling them, and what advice should they be giving the program manager. But the system and EIA standard has, very specific ways that this should work together in order to be a compliant system. So next slide, please. So let's talk about the compliance process. We'd mentioned on the earlier slide that compliance is important, because it's important to look at how the contractors are integrating this data, so that the data that programs are getting and the reports they're getting actually represent the technical status of what's going on the program. There's a set of EVMS requirements, and they start with the EIA standard, obviously. There's the DAR supplement, which talks about the applicability of earned value. There's a DoD interpretation guide, which takes each one of the 32 guidelines and describes program management benefit, purpose of the guideline, that sort of thing, and then identifies a set of attributes that would be seen by that particular guideline. And then DCMA further decomposes that into how would they test for those attributes. and they have a whole host of internal business processes. These are publicly available, so it's well known what the requirements are and what's expected. They evaluate a contractor's EVMS through this compliance review. The Earned Value Management Center has teams of folks that go out and do that. They create a business system analysis report, again, which is defined and can be seen on their website. And then they provide that report to the contracting officer who has the authority to approve or disapprove a business system. Typically, this report comes in, and not always is it to say, hey, carte blanche, let's approve this. It's, hey, the system has these deficiencies, and you should go to the contractor and let's figure out how they can solve those deficiencies. So there's an initial determination, and then they work with the contractor to sort through how those deficiencies will be resolved. And then there's a final approval at some point, and then that contractor uses that system to execute contracts. The reason to go through the kind of, and the process is much more complex than this. It's just a simplified way to visualize, so that as we talk about how we're thinking about implementing the model, we use this as a basis. Next slide, please. So the language we're talking about, and first of all, in fiscal year 2011, EVMS was made a business system, along with accounting systems, material management accounting system, property management, estimating systems. There's 6 in total. EVMS is one of them, and it was done to improve, to give the government authority to review those systems and have appropriate repercussions with the intent of improving the contractor business systems that manage our programs. In fiscal year 17, the business system rule was further added to, I guess, in order to allow contractors to use a third party, specifically registered public accounting firms, to essentially review their business systems and come up with a certified report that attests to the fact that the system meets all the requirements that are published by the government, and that should be enough for the ACO to review and then provide an approval or disapproval. And as you can imagine, the government who does this has been doing it for years. They're experts at it. There's a lot of internal interaction between them and the contractor. So when we start to think about a third party and how they're going to accomplish that, there are definitely some considerations, and I'll talk about those in a couple of slides. Next slide. So this slide just talks high level what the study is all about. It's really to look at the fiscal year 17, look for ways that that law could be implemented with respect to EVMS. The law actually refers to all 6 business systems. We talked about the sponsors period of performance. It ends in July, so we're not quite done with the entire study, but we've collected a lot of excellent information and have a draft model that we're working through. Again, the study where it's being done, active participants, DCMA has been extremely helpful. The Air Force, Navy, Space Force. There's other MDA, NRO organizations, the EVM subject matter experts that participate as they can as well, because it's really these EVM compliance experts that know best as to how something like this might work. And so what we've looked at is we've looked at some current suppliers who do EVMS gap analysis or requirements analysis, not necessarily the way the law would like it to be done, as far as it, coming up with a certified report that the government, would look at. But it is done. They look at the requirements. They work with the defense contractors to try to, get ready for the compliance reviews and that sort of stuff. We've talked to defense contractors about what they think about the third party, and we've talked to at least one registered public accounting firm that actually does this kind of thing, and what they thought about it. So we're really trying to make the rounds as to figure out, first of all, is there a market for it? Are these guys interested in it? And what would make sense as far as requirements that we would lay on a process like this. Next slide. So this slide, again, if I don't have the ability to put side by side, but same EVMS requirements, we're determining that we likely need to augment these requirements to be in more detail if a third party is going to be engaged, particularly with making sure we specify the level of detail in the report that would be required so that the ACO would have enough information. And there's a few other things that we're thinking there's additional requirements we need to add. Again, this third party would be contracted to, at least in this model that we're envisioning, by the contractor, because the law says a contractor can provide certified documentation from a third party, that attests to that it meets the requirements. That certified documentation is envisioned to be provided to the contracting officer, which is typically, the ACO or DACO, which is typically DCMA, and they still have the EVM center that would be advising that sort of thing, and they would use that information to try to assess whether they could approve or disapprove. And so, there's still obviously no real agreement as to how this plays out. But we're definitely identifying some risks associated with the level of detail of this report, and then the ability of the government to go back and understand that report, since the law talks about with no further government review. And right now we're interpreting that as we can go back to the contractor and ask some questions to try to better understand that report, but to actually go in and do a separate compliance review is, I think, what the law is trying to get to. And we still have some, we're collecting a set of questions we're going to take to the Office of General Counsel, with these assumptions. But we tried to minimize in a model, try to come up with how would we minimize the entire overall process, so that we don't lose, the ability for the government to have the authority to approve or disapprove systems. And we're also considering the fact that DCMA, as part of their contract surveillance process, not just program integration kinds of things, but they do annual compliance assessments on these systems that would likely still be intact. It's just these upfront reviews that we're thinking the third party would do. So again, draft model, can't say that we have full agreement, but it's causing a lot of great discussion. Next slide. So what we found is, the highest priority risks and questions that are coming out of it is, number one was, what was the impetus of the fiscal year 11 edition of the business system law, and then its associated third party. We did get an opportunity to talk with some staffers through legislative affairs at OSD, and we asked these questions, and not many of the staffers that are there today were there in 11. But fundamentally, the business system law was really derived for the financial business systems, to make sure that they were all solid and that kind of thing. EVMS was added as a business system at the time. And then now the third party was added in 17, at least in the congressional discussion. These staffers have access to the notes that the congressional meetings have. And the discussion was really around DCAA and their ability to keep up with, approving CAS system, accounting systems against the CAS standard. And the reason is that all DoD contractors, not just a subset, need to have these financial systems in place. And so there's a lot more contractors that have to be reviewed. And what the staffers thought is that this fiscal year 17 edition was really to allow a contractor to use a third party so that they could get their system approved quicker and that sort of thing, and to alleviate DCAA's backlog. But not much discussion about how that should apply or why it would apply to EVMS. So we continue those discussions, and we've got an action that we're going to go forward with to try to better understand that as well. And then what additional requirements need to be documented? In particular, what level of detail do you need in that report in order to support a government decision? That our discussion around this whole model is probably 90%. How do we know the third party is going to be doing a thorough enough job and documenting what needs to be documented to give the government the information they need to do an approval and have it make sense? And so we've got some risk mitigation we got to do associated with that. And then, what recourse does the government have if for some reason that EVMS is showing material weaknesses during annual surveillance or other times? So, and in order to try to address these risks, we've got essentially a three-pronged approach here. Is number one is the context and intent is these charts were created before we actually had the meeting, but we actually had an hour-long meeting with 6 or 7 of the HASC and SASC staffers, excellent discussion, and it's still not clear why EVMS is a business system, number one, and number two, how it would apply to this third party, because as some of the core team says, as you start to integrate all these other financial systems, it's a bit more complex, and whether a third party can do that or not is the question. Another one is to try to understand better that other questions come up is, well, what would it cost? How much would a contractor have to pay a third party in order to do this? So we're constructing it. I'm calling it a request for information, but it's not going to be a formal. It's more of a market research that we'll send out to industry to just answer, if they can, some really high level, top level questions about, what would the range of costs be to do this kind of a review? What factors would have it be at the low end of that cost? What factors would cause it to be at the high end of that cost, and about how long would it take? And oh, by the way, what kind of data would be in the report? What would you document, and what other kind of artifacts would you include in a report like that? That sort of thing. So we'll put that out again just to try to gather some more information to see how it may influence the model. So we believe we're in a position where some of these high-level risks, particularly in how much it would cost, and this, and what the level of the report is, that we could define a test, a pilot, let's say, and execute a pilot after this study, potentially, or at least what we'll document as part of this study is the potential to run a pilot. Again, using Agile as a method, you don't have to pre-specify every detail of a system before you actually try to implement it. So we incrementally, let's test out some of the biggest questions we have. Let's get some data about that. Let's feed that back into the model. And then, if we need to do another pilot, we can iterate on it like that. And so we could incrementally implement a third-party model, would be the theory there. So that's the end of my presentation. Next slide, I think, is questions. So I'm open for questions as well.
All right. Thanks, Gordon. So two really different presentations, really looking at the detailed, how do you get a good software estimate, depending on the domain, how can you tailor that to the type of work you're doing? And then at the back end, once we take that estimate, put it on contract, what's the best way for the government to make sure that our contractors are employing effective cost and schedule monitoring for those efforts. I will say that the 2017 NDAA language is now 5 years old.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when language kind of gets this old, we do circle back to the staffers and kind of ask what the original intent was. And so as Gordon pointed out, this was this did cover all of the business systems. And so we've had some pretty, I'll say, energetic dialogue over what the government's role is in terms of validating the systems. And so folks have looked to the third-party auditors, like typically financial auditors, to say, why can't they do government business systems? And part of our answer has been that that when a third-party assessor, like an auditor, a major auditing company, goes in and does an assessment for a major company, they're doing it to protect really the company and its shareholders. And when we go in and DCMA, and when DCAA goes in and looks at cost accounting systems, and when we look at purchasing systems and estimating systems, we're protecting the government's interests. And so it is from two different perspectives. So with that sort of context, we do have a question from, and I'd like to send the first question out to you, Gordon. There's a question from Kevin Anderson that asks, how would you alleviate conflict of interest if a contractor is paying the third-party reviewer?
So yeah, and that's come up in the discussion, but what we would envision is that if a third party was contracted to do a review with the intention of providing that to the government for system approval, that same contractor would not be allowed to help the contractor that it's reviewing alleviate those issues. It would do like DCMA does. It would identify the issues, and then it would re-review the issues as the contractor implemented fixes. If it was a big enough company, then, and they did have people who were butts in seats, or people who there's ample precedents for setting up firewalls between the organizations and documenting how that would work. So I mean, conflict of interest along those lines and setting up firewalls is not a new issue.
Okay, thanks. Let me move on to some questions for Lieutenant Nick there. We got a robust set of questions for you. I'll start at the top. Regarding the fascinating cost and ESLOC model, how much do we know about the likely eventual size of a project in the onset? He imagined that a good part of the estimating challenge is not just the cost per ESLOC, but also the total scope of the project. Did your research look at the kind of the total scope of the project, or just the cost per ESLOC?
So I know my presentation focused mostly on cost per ESLOC, but every bit that I touched cost per ESLOC, there was a mirror image for ESLOC analysis. And so I know I focused on just cost, but there's an equally robust ESLOC analysis, and it was set up the exact same way. There are distributions modeling the ESLOC values for every commodity, every contractor, every contract group, contractor group, every service type, service, and so on. And then the same analysis was performed that I showed you in the presentation about holding one variable constant while varying another one to see how those values change, and if there's value in trying to drill down to a more specific distribution to model ESLOC just by itself. And so while I was doing this, in my mind, I kind of had a theory of how this would be applied, and all of this was in a fun environment of never having performed an estimate on my own, considering it was just in research and it was in an academic environment, where if you're able to input a distribution with its parameters to model cost, and then you're also able to implement a distribution that models ESLOC, you could then combine those two in your actual estimate and be able to compound both of those instances together to get sort of a more robust estimate, a more robust range of possible outcomes. And so there was there's certainly an ESLOC component, but I guess more so just because my degree was in cost, just for the presentation's sake, I did kind of focus on cost for that sake.
Yeah, I'll just point out that when I've spent time estimating programs in the past, the cost per ESLOC ends up being a pretty complex calculation in terms of the productivity of the team, the labor rate that's being charged.
Right.
There's a lot that goes into that. But if you don't have the size of the project right from the onset, you can often generate a result that's not as useful.
Sure.
I'll just offer as well that it goes the same with, particularly with earned value systems, that if you don't have a solid baseline plan that's going into that, a solid estimate going in, you can measure it with the world's best EVMS system that DCMA certifies, and you can still get crap out the other side because the plan itself was not effective. Let me toss one more at you there, Nick. John Camp thanks you for an excellent presentation and an impressive research team. I think he just said everyone else wrote your paper. I don't know if that's what he wrote. Just, do you have any intuition at all as to why Mission Command aircraft cost and ESLOC best fit is an exponential instead of a log normal distribution?
Sure. So a lot of the distributions that I found, log normal was by far the most common outcome for a lot of these distributions and how to actually place a probability density function on top of them. But a lot of them were so skewed right, meaning so much of the data set was on the far left side of these distributions and these histograms that if it were log normal, that peak was so far to the left that sometimes it was indistinguishable from an exponential function. And so the software that I was using many times, if exponential was the best option, it was, again, just due to that skewed nature. And if it were log normal, that hump in the PDF was so far to the left that it actually just ended up using an exponential one instead, so that there was no most likely outcome. It was just the smooth exponential distribution.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess I'll field a question since we're kind of rotating here. Samantha Laughlin asks about EVM IPM policy guidance and competency, asking, is DCMA working to convince OUSD A&S to fill the acquisition data and analytics IPM division position that's remained vacant? We implement the policies that are proposed by and brought to bear by OSD A&S. I'm not in the business of convincing them to fill positions. I can tell you, though, that I see the DCMA staff as often having some capability that augments the staff. So whether that's the industrial analysis division that's augmenting industrial policy, whether that's our cost and pricing team that supplements the work of the DPC team, or whether it's our EVMS team supplementing and support Mr. Cadman in his role and mission. I think that DCMA can fulfill a significant role in providing expertise to the A&S staff, where the pressure certainly on headcount in A&S has been really strong, and we have an operational agency that can add, I think, some real world experience in these areas to the policy folks on staff. So not specifically to fill that billet, but certainly in support of the work of Mr. Cadman and the team there at what used to be the PARCA. Let me toss it back up to the top here and throw another one at you, Nick. There's a question from Hai Wen from NavWar. Asks, from the outset, how do we estimate full scope within the Agile environment? I suspect this can only be done one MVCR at a time, since the developers don't plan beyond that, which may cover 1 to 2 years, but not the full FIDIP, the Future Years Defense Program. Also, I'll just say for programs, if you're going to estimate the whole thing, it's not limited by the FIDIP. You're going to have to estimate the entire effort associated with that program. It also seems the cost community is moving away from SLOC towards story points or function points. Is that your observation too, or do you think SLOC is still relevant?
Okay, so with regarding the full scope within the Agile environment, at least within my research, it really just focused on kind of the full scope. It didn't really dive too much into detail, so it's hard to say how much if some of these are analyzed at a more kind of incremental basis, or trying to move from one step forward to the next one and estimating them incrementally. So mine was more of the full scope estimate. So It's hard to say, and it kind of ties into the second part of your question. Unfortunately, being such a recent grad, and unfortunately, I haven't had my chance to get my hands too deep into how people still interpret software estimating, at least in the field. In the academic sense, we were still very much of the mind that ESLOC is certainly a great indication of size, but also wrapping in a sort of complexity figure. So it's always been a great figure to estimate. But as far as how the community is interpreting, how they want to evaluate it, whether it's function points or anything else, that I don't quite have the experience to be able to answer that one.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. For my foxhole on that, I don't think of ESLOC as SLOC, by the way. I think of it as effort. I think of it as the number of hours of a software engineer's time necessary to deliver a capability. And so whether that's, at least in my head, and I'm not an academic, or I haven't been one for many years, I feel like I should have a formula to translate function points into ESLOC or story points into ESLOC, because at the end of the day, I'm going to turn it into hours and dollars. So whatever it starts out with, I almost don't care. And ESLOC was sort of an intermediate model-driven output that said, if you're starting out with code that's a combination of new code, reuse, and modified, it lets you combine those into a single figure to say, okay, here's about how much that is. So I don't know either from current practice, but I do know from current practice that nobody ever starts out anymore with a clean sheet of paper. And so you need some way of estimating effort based on a variety of different types of code that are brought and integrated together. Let's go out to Mr. Kranz. I've got a question here from Samantha asking about the Office of Small Business Programs timeline for a pilot. Is the project team working with academia on research that focuses on risk of implementation of an independent public accountant and the risk of inaction? Is the OSBP involved in the pilot? If not, are these measures anticipated in the future?
Great question. First of all, right now, there is no pilot. We're trying to define the details of that pilot. And if this office, wants to participate in helping define the characteristics of what a pilot could look like, we're open. So send me your information, and we'd love to. But the risk right now that we're thinking that we want to try to address is, first of all, there's a question whether registered public accounting firms are the right people, because they really do have an audit, sense in mind. Are they really the right people to be third party, and do they have the expertise? When there are companies out there that are EVM experts, should they be allowed to be able to do it, or would they be forced to become, so that would probably be part of the pilot, is to try to, and again, we haven't defined it, it's just very preliminary ideas, is, see if we could get a registered public accounting firm, interested in the pilot, and then get one of these other firms interested in the pilot. And then based on how we scoped the pilot and what they did, we could learn a little bit about that. Maybe that would influence legislative language that says, hey, for EVMS, does it really have to be a, registered public accounting firm? That sort of thing. But if there's other risks that we could be looking at that you're aware of, I'd love to have you, help influence the definition of what this pilot is going to look like. Or
so
could look like.
Two things I'd like to bring out on that, Gordon. The first is that that EV, as it's implemented today, applies to contracts over $100 million, which largely takes it out of the realm of small business. So small businesses involvement in this, I think, should be relatively minimal, given the thresholds that are currently set. If the thresholds were lowered, then perhaps, if anything, I think in terms of the traditional full-blown EV, I would probably advocate for some consideration of those thresholds being raised, and that we not try to apply earned value to the kinds of contracts that really don't lend itself to that. So if you go back in time about, let's say 6 years ago,
Yeah.
we found ourselves trying to apply earned value to things like low rate initial production
Right.
and FPIF contracts and other things that didn't traditionally have full cost accounting. And I think that was really problematic.
Right. So just a response to that, sir, you're absolutely right that compliance is not done on anything except 100 million and over. But I don't remember if it's in the 5,000 instruction or if it's in DFARS. It
20,
still
right?
says that contractors who are executing cost and incentive programs between 20 and 100 million are still expected to use an EVMS compliant with EIA if they're going to be generating EVM reports. And DCMA is not doing anything from a compliance point of view with that. So there is an area of risk that the government is taking that maybe this could fill.
Yeah, I think that gets at, and one of the questions I had early on was, what problem are we solving with third-party assessors? I'm not sure that was entirely clear in the congressional language. It's not unlike what we've been trying to do on things like CMMC, where we've recognized that we had insufficient capacity to inspect every company from a cyber perspective,
Right.
and that our DIBCAC teams would have some limited capacity. So it's not unlike that. I think, like I said, I think the congressional language and the guidance coming on this is somewhat in a state of flux, or could
Agreed.
be in a state of flux given the age of this congressional language.
Yes, sir.
Let me go back to you, Nick. I think I've got our last question because you get to start and end, I think. So we had a question from Keith just asking if you can speak to related work going on at AFIT or elsewhere that you think is interesting in this space.
Sure. I think one of the cool things about my research is I think it's definitely ripe for future research. One of the things at the end of my thesis was regarding future research, and I think the framework that I use can be applied to other dependent variables that somebody's interested in. And so, especially with how, sir, you've mentioned productivity and other sort of man hours, or maybe it's hours per ESLOC or vice versa. That's another dependent variable that you could use the same sort of thought process that I used to now look at just different variables and see how those change based on different characteristics. So I think with that being said, there are areas for future research. As far as current work at AFIT, I'm not aware of any right now, but if anybody's interested to see what's going on at AFIT, you can go to the AFIT Scholar webpage and you can see all the sorts of different research that AFIT students and faculty have accomplished and see what's going on. But I do think the framework that I used and I think it can be applied to many other environments. And so it might be in situations that it may not have been possible before. I sort of came up with that process as a substitute for a traditional regression analysis, and just because my data set didn't quite lend itself to that method, so I had to pivot. And so hopefully somebody can use that method as a way to get around an obstacle that they may be running into. So I like to think that it can be further used, and then hopefully my findings can either be corroborated or they can be enhanced or corrected, and hopefully it can continue to be a finer project.
Thanks, Nick. So we are out of questions today, and I think just a few minutes early. I guess I'll leave it up to our host Michelle to see how she'd like to go from here with the remaining time. But again, I'd like to, for myself, thanks so much to the entire team today that put this on. Thank you, Nick. I can honestly say that I've yet to hear an Army lieutenant with that degree of technical rigor in a panel. That's pretty awesome. I'm not trying to recruit you. I think you joined the right service. And Gordon, thanks for all your hard work in this area. I told Nick earlier that I started my military career back in 1988. My first assignment after my training was to the Air Force Institute of Technology. And I've benefited from some of that Air Force technical excellence early in my career that helped prepare me for some pretty hard technical jobs later when I joined the Acquisition Corps. So again, thanks to the whole team at AFIT. Thank you, Gordon, for your support of today's panel and for your paper, and for all of the folks that participated and asked great questions. I was disappointed you didn't ask the Lieutenant Harder questions. I was hoping you could stump him just because he was from another service, but you didn't. So again, thanks everybody for your participation today, and back to you, Michelle.
All right, well done, and awesome to hear a mix of senior leadership and fresh student research. We're doing that here too, so it's a great conversation to be having.